Before the pandemic, there were 2,000 homeless people in Montreal on any given night. This number has since doubled. 10% of Montreal's homeless population is Indigenous, despite making up only 0.6% of the city's population. These statistics are even higher among Inuit, a population which represents only 10% of Indigenous people in the city, but accounts for 43% of homeless Montrealers who are Indigenous. In this episode of Local 514, we'll be looking into colonialism playing a role in increased homelessness among Indigenous communities, and in particular, Inuit in Montreal. So how exactly does colonialism lead to homelessness among some Indigenous populations?
There's lots of people who are homeless from lots of different cultures. And so it's not the only issue. But of course, we have this unfortunate history in Canada of over 100 years of cultural genocide. And, one of the sad realities of the last year is finding some of these, grave sites all across the country containing markings of genocide. When that's been the functioning of your country for over 100 years, there's going to be ramifications. There's going to be social problems that follow from that.
The Canadian government removed Indigenous children from their families and placed them into catalogs to be adopted by white families. This was called the 60 Scoop. It caused forced assimilation and generated great trauma, as did the residential school system. Trauma not only endured by those who experienced it, but passed down generations.
This is what we call intergenerational trauma. It begins with the suffering of the parents. Then, of course, everything that happens in the school. We've heard all the atrocities of the school. And that's what it was. It was to kill the Indian. To prepare him for the lower fringes of society, if anything.
The biggest population here would probably be Inuit, and among the Inuit who are here, the most common thing that you see are people who are second-generation residential school survivors. So maybe they didn't go to residential school themselves, but their parents did. They're, in some ways, yes, living out that reality.
For Inuit, some unique situations in the north have also led to precarity. In the 1950s, the federal government relocated many Inuit to the high north, about 2,000 kilometers from their homes. They were promised bountiful wildlife and food. However, they suffered from hunger, extreme cold, illness, poverty, and alcoholism. It was not until 3 decades later that many returned home again. Inuit women in Montreal are particularly at risk. Just last year, a group of Indigenous women from Caput Square in downtown Montreal said that since spring 2020, 7 Inuit women have died.
We have women here who've been raped so many times they don't know the number. Inuit women are frequently targeted by pimps and drug dealers. Then they begin a descent into a very dark world.
Us women, we go through hard times. Inuit people are going down a lot.
2 years ago, Connie Kadlutsiak gave this speech at a memorial after 2 of her friends died. And now, like so many others, Connie's black and white photo hangs on the Open Doors memorial wall. Other Inuk women, like 32-year-old Donna Pare, have vanished, gone unseen by family and friends for months, raising questions about whether police are actually helping.
Are we really looking hard enough? No one official has come in here asking anything about her.
So what urges some Inuit to migrate to cities such as Montreal?
Inuit Nunangat, a term in Inuuqatigiit meaning homeland, refers to the 4 Inuit land claim regions. The Northern Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Nunavik, which is in northern Quebec, and Inuuqatigiit in northern Labrador. 70% of Inuit households in Nunavut are food insecure. In comparison, only 8% nationally are food insecure. Food is much more expensive in the north. For example, Torontonians can purchase a box of rice for $6.99. But this very same box will cost $10.19 in Iqaluit. This is even after the $6.27 subsidy.
It hurts to know that a child my daughter's age, who's only 5, is actually hungry. It hurts. I can't imagine, and that's my daughter.
But it's the majority of kids in Nunavut.
With inflation on the rise, it's likely that these prices are rising in both regions. 9% of Canadians live in crowded homes, while 52% of Inuit in Inuit Nunangat live in these conditions. Some of these living conditions have been described as deplorable, with some homes housing 14 in a 4-bedroom dwelling. Water's coming through the floorboards, crumbling walls, black mold, broken windows and doors, resulting in children being taken away due to these living conditions. 3,120 Nunavut residents were on a waiting list for new housing in the 2021 fiscal year. Former Nunavut MP Makkovik released a report on housing conditions in Nunavut, based on her visits to homes across Nunavut in the fall of 2020.
We've seen apologies, and that's a step in the right direction, but concrete action, investing into homes for Nunavut is what the federal government needs to be doing. These violent cycles, these violent systems keep Inuit oppressed, and the federal government continues to feed into that.
In some cases, these situations can result in Inuit moving into metropolises, such as Montreal.
But this is not always easy for many.
Culture shock, I guess. Even though it is Canada and everything, it is very different from her little town. I'm worried about my kids adapting to a whole new life here.
I think a lot of people are not sure where to go for help. There's really no handbook or anything about moving down to the south from north. It's all experiences or connections you have with people down here. There was Inuit down here, but there was no specific programming or schools or anything, drop-in centers or anything like that. So unfortunately, I did lose a lot of my Inuit heritage in the first couple of years of being here.
David Chapman, Executive Director of Resilience Montreal, says there are 3 main reasons Inuit come to Montreal.
Inuit come down here for medical treatment. If you have a significant medical problem that requires a specialist, say an extended cancer treatment that you're going to need to go through, it's going to be more than what a small northern hospital can provide. Often, the city of Montreal can feel like this paradise, a paradise because the prices are so much cheaper than in the north. The second main reason why Inuit come to Montreal is there's actually a housing shortage in the north, where you have more families than you do houses. And then the third main reason why Inuit come to Montreal is, simply to seek a better life.
But once they arrive, housing security is not always guaranteed.
The Indigenous population who use our services are actually, for the most part, people who have been through a Housing First program where they get housed and rehoused and rehoused and rehoused. They've been kicked out of the program, the so-called long-term solution, and they're back on the street. Most of the Inuit who are using our services have been in a Housing First program. They've been rejected from the program. Now they're back on the street. And the end result has been frequently that there's more racism among landlords who are now less willing to rent to Inuit. And this doesn't get picked up by the researchers, let me tell you. In fact, I was the supervisor of one such program. And I can tell you there was an awful lot of pressure on me not to share about failings in the program. All right? In other words, it was getting harder and harder to house the participants in our program. And instead of saying, hey, maybe the model isn't working, the approach was, let's not let that information out. Let's not talk about that.
So can those who want to leave Montreal and return to Inuit Nunangat do so?
When they want to go home, they need 2 pieces of ID for the plane, which outreach workers say is nearly impossible for people living on the street.
Perron says that the ISWP provided services such as trailers, warming tents, and housing for Indigenous homeless people. However, at the end of March, this funding was cut by the city.
And this year, with the one other Inuit person dying, just like last year, it was all over the media, the city of Montreal gave us a heating tent. So, so what happens is the neighbors were very, very, very upset of our presence there. Very upset that we were there and the large numbers of Inuit and their uncivilities and whatnot. So they made several complaints to the city of Montreal. They signed petitions and whatnot. As of March 31st, we are back to just working on the streets. City of Montreal makes these decisions, or people have been making decisions for us, okay, without ever consulting us.
With the funding the city gave from December to March, the ISWP was able to relocate 12 Indigenous people from the streets and into permanent housing.
We got some funding to successfully put 12 hardcore street people, Inuit people, Native people into apartments. You know, now two of the people in apartments have been shadow workers for ISWP. This is the best thing here. They've been shadow workers for ISWP, meaning I'd go on the bricks, on the streets, and they'd follow me with a backpack full of supplies and all that. They can get in there and speak the language and know the community and know their cousins and all that. So they've proven to be great assets. We want to slowly prepare these people for the real world job market.
Chapman says that the city calls these Band-Aid solutions and that long-term investments, like housing, are the priority for funding.
I think Raphael Andre would have been happy to have a heated tent on the night he died.
Naguset, executive director of the Native Women's Shelter, who is Cree, says that the foster care system can generate homelessness.
I've been working at the shelter since 1999, and we definitely saw a correlation when we were doing the intakes back then, when I was doing intakes back then, about the women that came to the shelter had themselves been in youth protection, and then when they had children, their kids were in youth protection. So, you know, the idea of homelessness, of people coming to the shelter, having that experience of being in youth protection, and then, you know, the cycle continuing by that next generation also being in youth protection. And a lot of the times, as soon as when you age out of the system, you go straight to the streets.
She says that colonialism doesn't only generate homelessness.
The fact that we're overrepresented, in the jails, and the fact that, we're overrepresented in the child welfare system. And it's just, there's an enormous amount of obstacles and a lot of ill will. If you think about the hospitals in Joyce Echaquan, right? The fact that, the government is supposed to do better, but hasn't yet. The population is suffering because of it. And usually the only people that come to our aid are our own people.
The wealth inequality, inhumane living conditions, food insecurity, and other factors that continue colonization all need to be addressed. Contrary to common belief, colonialism is still very much a present-day issue and should not only be seen as a relic of the past. With trauma from colonialism and colonial practice extending into how the foster care system is run, and the living conditions in Inuit Nunangat largely ignored by the government, this continues to generate barriers for many Indigenous people, barriers that most of us don't face, thus continuing the cycle of homelessness and lack of reconciliation in Canada. If you want to learn more about how the foster care system is detrimental to Indigenous children, click here to watch our video on the topic. Let us know what you think in the comments.